If you've heard of the cult classic EarthBound, you'd know it's a pretty unique game for its time. This uniqueness even lends itself to the speedrunning scene, with EarthBound being on a level of its own compared to other speedruns within the RPG genre. There's a ton of randomness, or RNG within this game, but the amount of ways runners can mitigate bad luck compared to other speedruns is astounding. On-the-fly decision making is at the core of EarthBound speedrunning, and it is paramount to achieving top times in most categories. Some categories like any percent require the use of RNG manipulation and major glitches to remove influences of luck, but other categories forbid the use of these exploits, creating a more traditional gaming experience. This means avoiding enemies chasing you in the overworld, reacting quickly to a character taking mortal damage, improvising if you don't have enough money for key shopping points, and much, much more. For the past 17 years as of the posting of this video, EarthBound speedrunning has seen these records come down further and further, with it all leading up to this past year or so, where one runner has dominated the entire EarthBound speedrunning scene. This runner, who goes by the name of Octopuscal, is the only person ever to hold every official record in EarthBound and Mother 2 at the same time. However, there is one record that just happened on March 21st, 2022 in EarthBound's Glitchless No Manipulation category. Octo, Chikubi, Hannibal Graham, and Cerium were all in a 2-minute range from each other. So at first guess, the new record couldn't have been much of a jump, right?
What the?
Octo didn't just set a new record, he achieved a time which was considered to be impossible before now. When he posted his final splits in the EarthBound speedrunning Discord, everyone was shocked that his final time was so far ahead of his previous record. Now as a viewer, I'm sure you have a ton of questions. The first one that comes to my mind is, what makes this achievement so different compared to the others that came before it? In this video, I'm going to tell you about the history leading up to Octopuscal's new record. Then, we'll dive into what makes this run so great and how it overcomes the unforgiving randomness EarthBound speedruns are infamous for. Let's go back to 2006. The website Speed Demos Archive was the main hub for speedrunning, where community members would collaborate on strategies, post updates about their times, and send VCR tapes to verifiers so they can have their runs featured on the site. EarthBound, like other RPGs at the time, posed a challenge due to the game being so long, but thanks to community pioneers like Evil Ninja, Mickey Mage, and SDFG, they were able to cut this down from over 7 hours to about 4 hours over the course of 2 years in a segmented setting. The segmented speedruns are designed to be done over time, with sections being played over and over to get as close to a perfect run as possible. Alternatively, single segment speedruns are all done in one sitting. This is important as the era of live streaming began to overtake the speedrunning community, and doing runs in a single sitting became more common, turning into how the community takes on these challenges to this day. With that being said, what does an EarthBound speedrun even look like? For those unfamiliar, let's take a quick look at the game's route for context. You play as Ness, just a normal boy with a normal family who lives in the normal town of Onett. However, things become not so normal when the meteorite crashes on the hill outside of Ness's house. And when Ness goes to examine it later on, the flying insect Buzz emerges from the meteorite. After a lore dump about Gaius taking over the world, and a short tutorial fight against the Starman, Buzz meets his untimely end against your neighbor's mom, Lardna. Before Buzz dies, he gives Ness a soundstone and tells him to seek the 8 My Sanctuaries throughout the world, which will help him defeat Gaius. These sanctuaries are defended by guardians, and once they're defeated, players receive part of a melody for their soundstone. In the glitchless category, the route follows the game's story without too much deviation. However, while the game implies there's an order to the sanctuaries you need to visit, it's possible to skip one sanctuary and move to the next. This is excellent, as runners can move places like Lilliput Steps and Milky Well to the cleanup before the end of the game, making them much faster compared to completing them as intended. After the player collects 8 melodies, they're taken to Magicant to fight Ness's Nightmare to awaken his inner powers. Once Nightmare is defeated, there's a couple more tasks to do before traveling to the past and fighting Gaius. Then that's it, the run is done after defeating Gaius in phase 3 of his fight. The strategies runners use to beat the game fast really just come down to a couple of things. avoiding as many random encounters as possible, and using a ton of consumable items to damage bosses. The two in particular are super bombs and bottle rockets, both of which can be purchased from various points in the game. Super bombs can be used by any party member, and they deal 270 base damage with a range of plus or minus 50% in either direction, meaning 405 damage is the highest and 135 is the lowest. It also deals splash damage directly to the left and right with a base of 135 damage, with a range of plus or minus 50% as well. Jeff is the only character who can use bottle rockets, which will deal 120 base damage with a range of plus or minus 25%. These can also miss depending on Jeff's speed compared to the enemy speed, which is derived from this formula. This is compounded with big bottle rockets and multi-bottle rockets, with the BBRs being equivalent of 5 bottle rockets and MBRs being the equivalent of 20 bottle rockets. If Jeff gets an item that gives him a ton of speed, like the Rabbit's Foot, MBRs become a reliable source of massive damage in the late game, capping out at a potential of 3000 damage per use. With such high damage output in the endgame, it makes sense that sanctuaries that could be completed earlier are pushed back until players can bomb their targets from orbit. This has been the general strategy that glitchless runs have used for years, and would continue to be the focus of runs going into the live streaming era of speedrunning. From 2012 onward, runners such as Skateman222, Oxwis, SDFG, and Andy Perfect would continue to push their times down. These time gains were massive at first, but as new records were coming into the 4.5 hour range, jumps in the record went from over 10 minutes at once to just a couple of minutes with larger gaps in time in between each record. After a long period of activity from Andy Perfect and SDFG, Andy set his final record of the year with a 4:11:25 on June 12, 2014. Now all of this history is relevant because the next glitchless record marks the first use of RNG manipulation in the category. I briefly touched on what RNG manip was earlier, but let's talk more on what it actually does in the speedrun. There are 3 separate values that influence a variety of things in the game: non-scripted NPC movement, enemy spawns, item drops from battles, enemy attacks, damage rolls, and even smash attacks can be manipulated by the player. This is all great. In fact, many runners have used RNG manipulation to achieve top times in EarthBound glitchless. However, a major problem with the manipulation stems from how it's performed. The 3 RNG values that influence all of these events are updated in many ways. If NPCs are loaded in, every time each one moves, that's an update of RNG 1 and RNG 2. Every time you move the cursor, press A or press B in a menu, those are updates as well. Even characters of text being printed on the screen influence these RNG values. RNG 3, however, is a little different. RNG 3 is updated when Ness crosses over these invisible lines on the edge of 64 by 64 pixel squares. There are other minor ways to update RNG 3, but this is the main one runners will be dealing with in their attempts. If you mess up any movement or inputs, it could very well throw off RNG completely. And with these values only being pushed forward, most times there's no way to recover the manip. In short, if you don't play perfectly, it's a reset. At first, this wasn't a big deal, as manipulation was limited to getting an optimal intro up to the Starman Jr. fight, which is only about 7 minutes in. However, SDFG extended this manipulation to the entirety of Onet, requiring perfect play for nearly 20 minutes. A few years later, in September of 2017, manipulation was extended by Tootler Fiber 7 to reach all the way through the second sanctuary, Little Putt Steps. This made the manipulation over 30 minutes long, but allowed runners to complete this part of the game without having to come back closer to the end of the run. The manip drops shortly after this point, so the rest of the run is subject to the normal randomness you expect from EarthBound. As someone with tons of experience in this manipulation, I can say that this requires many hours of practice before implementing it in runs, and even the most veteran of players can drop the manip at any time. This is why Glitchless No Manipulation has such an allure to it. Yes, there's the RNG of random encounters and unforgiving bosses, but for some runners, they just don't want to deal with it. So the next question at this point is obvious. What's the time difference between using manipulation and not using it in Glitchless? Current strategies for the manip in Onet leave the player defeating Captain Strong at about 18.5 minutes. For non-manip, top runners will have a Captain Strong split with a range of 25 to 27 minutes. So let's say that the Manip saves about 7.5 minutes on average in Onet. Tucson, Peaceful Rest Valley, and Happy Happy Village have a ton of random points which can cause time loss or even a reset. The boss of this area, Car Painter, also has a lot of RNG. The manipulation completes this fight in about 29 minutes. Without manipulation, top runners will defeat Car Painter within a range of 39 to 41 minutes. We'll say this is an additional 3 minutes, leaving us with 10.5 minutes of time save currently. The last main point of time save is from doing Mondo Mole early. Normally, runners would need to come back during the Sanctuary cleanup using the Teleport PSI ability, which is the game's fast travel for those who don't know. Happy Happy Village is not a location on the teleport list, so runners need to first grab an exit mouse from Onet, which returns players to the beginning of a dungeon when used, then teleport to Tucson to run all the way back to Happy Happy Village. From the first teleport back to Onet to the entry to Lilliput Steps takes a total of about 2.5 minutes. Doing RNG manipulation skips this return sequence entirely, but accounting for a longer fight with Mondamole and the Manip, we'll treat this as 2 minutes of time save. This puts us at about 12.5 minutes of time saved from performing the Manip compared to not doing it. The amount of this could be more or less depending on the runner, but this is the best estimate we're going to get. Let's take these 12.5 minutes and remove that from these top 3 times in the Glitchless Manipulation category. These times move up to just over 3 hours and 50 minutes in this comparison, still nearly 5 minutes behind Octo's new record. If we apply the 12.5 minute time save to Octo's 345, that translates loosely to a mid 3 hour and 33 minute time with manipulation. An absolutely mind-boggling time. For context, ever since the first sub 3 hour and 40 minute time was achieved, the community has speculated that a 336 or 335 would be the absolute limit for a human to achieve in a single sitting. We've went over a ton on why this run was monumental, but haven't touched on what actually happened to make this all possible. Let's look at the main points of RNG in Octo's record and how they were handled. Starting with Onet, Octopuscal finished the Captain Strong fight with a time of 25 minutes and 51 seconds. This is even with a less than perfect grind at Giant Step, which usually wastes a lot of time. Runners need to grind up to level 8 with Ness before fighting the first Sanctuary boss, Titanic Ant. At this level, Ness learns the ability PSI Rock and Alpha, which does a range of 40 to 120 damage to every enemy in battle. Part of the reason why this is necessary isn't just because of the Titanic Ant, it's actually because of these little guys right here. The Antoids in this battle will constantly use the healing spell Life Up, recovering the target's HP. So if you go in without a plan to beat the 2 Antoids at the same time, any damage done to Titanic Ant will mean nothing. The manipulated run forces 2 bombs to drop from the attack slug encounters near the beginning of Giant Step, which both have a 1 out of 128 chance to drop. Runners can't rely on this, which is why they grind levels instead. During this grind, Octo got less than perfect luck when trying to get the slugs to spawn, and in some of the encounters, Ness kept missing his attacks, losing him at most 7 seconds each time he would miss an enemy. All of this aside, the fact that he was able to push out a sub 26 time after defeating Captain Strong is nothing short of amazing, and it was still almost 9 seconds behind his previous personal best. Moving forward to the next area with a ton of variance, Peaceful Rest Valley is a source of pain for runners of all skill levels. The spawn rates are completely unfair, walkable terrain is narrow and hard to navigate, and many of these enemies are stronger and faster than Ness. So as the name suggests, PRV is where many runs go to die. Runners hope to get through this area without taking an encounter, but it's likely they will have multiple fights before finishing this section. Octo ended up getting stuck between multiple spawns about halfway through PRV, being forced to take a battle with 2 mobile sprouts. When it comes to encounters in EarthBound, the best option is to avoid them altogether. This is done thanks to despawning enemies by moving them off screen, juking them by predicting their movement patterns, or slowly moving past ones that only move when the player moves. If runners have to enter a fight, most times the best option is to run away. However, because running away is a formula that is based on player speed compared to enemy speed, running away is not always possible. This puts players in a position where they have to use the best attacks for the situation, and it's where experience with the game matters the most. Split-second decision-making will define whether a situation is either inconvenient or if it destroys an entire run. Octo handled Peaceful Rest Valley very well, all things considered, and with only one encounter, he moves on to Happy Happy Village and eventually reaches the boss of the area, Car Painter. The boss is 100% predictable, as he cycles through 2 sets of 3 actions. The first set of actions are something called a Crashing Boom Bang attack, which is 2 attacks that are the equivalent of the Thunder Beta PSI ability, Life Up Alpha, and a Pain attack, which deals around 50 damage at this point in the game. The second set of actions are the same, but instead of using Life Up Alpha, Car Painter will use PSI Shield Alpha, protecting himself from PSI attacks. As long as runners play it safe, the fight is pretty simple, especially due to the Franklin badge that another main character, Paula, gives the player shortly before this area. The Franklin badge reflects any lightning attack back at the user when the player who has it is targeted. Since this lightning attack does a range of 60 to 180 damage, and the fact that Car Painter has 262 hit points, having 2 of these hit the boss would make quick work of him. The manipulation does exactly this, causing both of his lightning attacks to be reflected on turn 1 with fatal damage rolls, instantly ending the battle. Octo doesn't get this lucky, but he does finish the fight at the beginning of Cycle 3, right before the Car Painter's second Life Up Alpha. Car Painter can give a lot worse RNG than this, so we can consider this to be an average fight. This puts Octo just over a minute behind his personal best at this point, but considering how a 39-minute Car Painter fight completion is already good, his last run at this point would be a tough nut to crack. Moving forward about 15 minutes, Octo is in the winter section of the run where he plays as Jeff, specifically right before the short brick road section, and the pawn cave right after it. This is also the first segment where Glitchless Manip and Glitchless No Manip strategies begin to merge. Let's start this area by talking about Brick Road. This small dungeon has a ton of narrow walkways, with enemies guarding certain areas. The ones we want to focus on are the worthless protoplasm on the lower right, the Mad Duck in the middle, and the second worthless protoplasm on the top left. These are low-level enemies in the grand scale of things, but unfortunately Jeff starts out at level 1 with only 30 HP. This is terrifying, as the first protoplasm enemy is surprisingly fast and deals about 10 damage with each hit. So the fight can end in 3 turns if one is unlucky. However, that's not even the worst of it. The protoplasm can also call for help, bringing another one into the battle. If this happens, runners will have to heal using one of their boiled eggs and hope the strats they use don't cost them the fight. This fight is very annoying, and it's not just because of the things I mentioned. It's also because you're unable to run away from protoplasm within the first couple of turns. So the remaining actions are one of the following: attacking and defeating the protoplasm by turn 3, which runners have to bank on the attack not missing, the protoplasm not being able to call for help, and not taking enough damage to require a heal. Or, runners can defend and heal until running away becomes realistically viable. Depending on the situation, this could be as early as turn 4 or 5, or it could be so late that it's the last turn before Jeff dies from the encounter. Octo was able to escape from this fight on turn 5 with no deaths. Great RNG compared to how bad it could have been. After that encounter, there were 2 others Octo needed to deal with. However, these had the potential to be skipped as long as Jeff's little companion cooperated. Bubble Monkey is a temporary party member who is unique in the way he follows you in the overworld. Sometimes, he will randomly stop in place despite the player still moving the lead party member. Now, this doesn't sound like much, but when enemies can trigger encounters by coming in contact with any party member, that's where things get a little bit silly. There's a reason why many in the EarthBound speedrunning community have an extreme dislike for Bubble Monkey. For the Mad Duck, you could take the time to lure him out of his corner and get him stuck to where he can't chase you. As for the second protoplasm, you can lure him out at the very top with Jeff, as the present sprite will move in a straight line for a certain distance without the ability to change direction while moving. Doing this gives the player just enough space to dodge the sprite, skipping the last brick road encounter. However, this only works if Bubble Monkey follows while doing this dodge. Octo gets the Mad Duck skip without even needing to lure him away, so let's see what he does with the second protoplasm.
避けてほしいな。ああ、よっしゃ避けられた。
He gets to skip, and he can make his way to the pawn cave without much time loss. However, things would begin to go badly when he tried to move through the cave. While not as narrow as Brick Road, Pawn Cave has points which are tight squeezes. Combine this with enemy spawns between these little areas, and runners are in for some trouble if they're not careful. Earlier, I talked about slow movements to get past enemies that only move when you're moving. This is a strategy called stutter stepping. There are two types of main enemy movement in EarthBound. The type where enemies move even if Ness isn't in the enemy's area of influence, and the type where enemies move only when Ness is in their area of influence. Now there are subcategories of this movement type, but specifically we're going to look at this one. These enemies only move when Ness moves, and this is something we can take advantage of. If you start and stop movement within 4 frames, or about 1/15 of a second in this case, then enemies will not detect that Ness has moved. If you rhythmically tap the direction you want to go on the D-pad, you can slip past these enemies without having to fight them. This is a major strategy used throughout the game, and is important if runners want to get even remotely close to a competitive time, as taken encounters can be very slow. However, many spawns can create lag, which slows down the game and makes it harder to stutter step in those situations. Octo had some issues with spawns and stutter stepping in the Pawn Cave, resulting in 3 separate encounters throughout. Coming to the end of Winters, this didn't lose him any time against his previous run. In fact, he gained a second and a half. However, his best possible Winters is over a minute faster, meaning up to a minute of possible time save was lost there. Being 30 seconds behind and an hour into the run, it's easy to want a better time, especially when the potential was there and then lost. When I asked Octopuscal his thoughts on his early game, he said something that I felt was important.
ウィンターズでも敵と出会って、低予算ダンジョンはスムーズに出られたんですけど、レイニーサークルの洞窟で3回敵に当たりました。あとジャイアントステップでネスが向こう水はナメクジに何回も空振りしてタイムロスしました。ただ簡単にタイムが変わるカテゴリーではあるので、リセットを考えるほどではなかったです。
In EarthBound Glitchless, the course of a run can change in an instant. It doesn't matter if it's an hour in or on the final split. Things could look hopeless, but then turn around to become something amazing. With that in mind, let's move forward past the minor boss fight and into another major section of RNG. 3 Graveyard and the cave which comes right after are the beginning of a 15-minute section that can end runs in an instant. The outside of the cave has aggressive spawns which will likely leave runners taking an encounter or 2 before entering the cave. Some of these are no good flies, which are easy to deal with. Then there are these enemies called stinky ghosts and zombie possessors. These enemies have the ability to cause one of your characters to be possessed by a ghost, and it's one of the most annoying status effects in the game. This brings an additional enemy to the battle who can attack a random party member or solidify them, interrupting their turn. Octo didn't have this issue in his run, but it's not uncommon to get caught by one of these enemies. Going into 3 Cave, this is another area with small rooms, and these rooms contain zombies and zombie dogs, which actively move as soon as they're loaded in. The zombies are not too horrible to deal with, but the zombie dogs can quickly end a run. Not only do they have powerful attacks, but they can inflict poison on a party member, which runners do not have a way to deal with on the fly. Runners do have an item that heals this, but it needs to be used later on in a boss fight. This section is extremely dangerous, as these enemies can spawn really close to the player as soon as they enter the room. Runners need to be quick on their feet to properly despawn these enemies, which is done by leaving and re-entering the room. As for Octo's run, he had ways to make this area a little more forgiving. First of all, reacting to enemy spawns was easier due to a little trick he used. If you press the B button to open the menu, you can still see most of the game area and you can give yourself more time to make a decision depending on the situation. Second, Octo bought some skip sandwiches earlier, which are consumable items that double the player's overworld movement speed when eaten. This is something that runners use to cleverly dodge encounters throughout the run, and Octo uses it here in combination with precise timing to get a green swirl on the encounter. It took Octo just over a minute to reach the boss of 3 Cave after entering the area, as he only took 1 encounter, with other rooms having little to no despawning. In many cases, You will see runs which take an average of 2 or 3 minutes to reach the end of the cave, and that's only if runners survive the dangerous encounters within. The next part of this dangerous section is a place called Grapefruit Falls. This area follows a similar theme as before, narrow pathways with a ton of spawns. Not surprising, but there's another issue with this area in particular. There's not a lot of room to despawn enemies when they show up, and when moving through this area, it's possible to get surrounded by new enemy spawns. The community refers to this as getting pincered, and is another cause of major time loss and resets in various sections, including this one. Octo gets incredibly lucky here, taking no encounters during his first trip through before entering Belch's base. And before you ask, the Glitchless category requires runners to say the password before entering the base. That's right, the 3-minute wait is required, and there's no way to skip it, just as the developers intended. Anyways, Belch's base is the last part of this brutal trifecta. The amount of spawns in the area is immense, and we're talking about foppies, no good flies, and the worst of them all, slimy little piles. These enemies are harmless enough, as Paula can hit them with the freeze PSI attack and they go down. But if these guys get a turn, things get a little unhinged. These guys can call for help, and they will fill up the screen with enemies fast. They'll also do a burping attack which causes the player's party to start crying, causing most physical attacks to miss. Finally, battles with these enemies are treated as scripted, so it's impossible to run away from them. Plus, there's a chance you could run out of PSI points and get stuck in an endless loop of missed attacks and calls for help until the party dies. The last section before entering the boss room is the worst spot for spawns. While foppies can't spawn here, slimes and flies will pop up more often than not. So runners have to despawn the first area of what they can see, then hope more actively moving enemies don't spawn off screen. And finally, they have to stutter step past the slime that is guaranteed to spawn in the area, all while dealing with potential lag from other spawns. A lot of the time, this is where runners will take an encounter, losing any possible time gain from this section. So how did Octo do here? Actually, he performed pretty well, all things considered. He had to take 3 encounters before reaching Master Belch, one of those being the scripted slimy pile fight. However, no one called for help in any of the fights, and despawning didn't take more than a few attempts with each area. This was enough to have him gain 8.5 seconds out of the 59 he could realistically save. After defeating Master Belch, Octo uses an exit mouse to return to the beginning of the base and makes his way back down Grapefruit Falls. His second trip was just as good as the first, minimal respawns with no encounters taken, giving him a good time cushion for another area with a massive amount of RNG. The Mole Cave in the middle of Dusty Dunes is the next dungeon, and its completion is required to gain the Diamond Key item. This can be given to the owner of the Tapala Theater in Forside and opens up the department store right after. Before the miner Gerardo goes in and digs for treasure, you have to clear out the monsters in the cave, particularly the 5 powerful moles who all think they're the 3rd strongest. This dungeon follows the theme of having narrow pathways with brutal spawn locations, which will slow down or end runs if players are not careful. Part of this is due to the party being underleveled for this dungeon, meaning enemies will most likely go first and hit players with a range of damage and status effects. The ones we really need to worry about are poison and paralysis. Poison comes from the snake enemies in the area, and if it happens early in the cave, it might be enough to end a run. Runners won't get healing beta to cure the status until later in the dungeon, and it's likely if a character had a refreshing herb earlier, it was used to heal poison on Belch, as he will always try to inflict the status on turn 1. As for paralysis, the gigantic ants in this area can inflict the status, preventing the player from using items and physical attacks with whoever is afflicted. This one requires a secret herb or healing gamma to heal, so it's likely this status will stick with the character until exiting the dungeon. There's also another dangerous enemy called the Hanging Noose Man. Runners will encounter him later on in the dungeon, with the worst location being on the way to the 5th mole. These enemies are highly resistant to freeze, and can nearly one-shot every party member except Ness. The best option here is to run away, but this could take several turns if runners are unlucky, and by then it's likely way too late. How does this affect getting through the cave? If Ness gets poisoned and dies, there's no way to heal Jeff or Paula, and it's unlikely they'll survive 2 or more boss fights. If players lose Paula, the turns to defeat the mole bosses go up immensely. Freeze Beta makes these fights last 2 turns on average, with fights only being 1 turn when Jeff has a BBR to expend. If Jeff dies, it's not really a big deal. He doesn't particularly need the levels, and even if he can't use his BBRs on the first 2 moles, Paula comes in clutch with Freeze Beta, getting the 2-turn kill most of the time. In regards to Paula's PSI point usage, she can hold her own until grabbing a butterfly or getting the PSI caramel after the 4th mole, healing 20 PSI points on use. Each strongest mole has 386 HP and doesn't resist freeze, making their fights pretty quick. However, the moles have a few things which can turn the tide of battle if runners don't set up properly. Most of the time, these moles will go first, so to prepare for an attack, runners will queue up a Life Up Alpha to use on Paula, who has the lowest HP. Ness will always take his action sometime after Paula at this point, so it's a safety strat that all runners use. Octo was able to make it through Mole Cave with almost no issue. While there were a few despawns in the later half of the dungeon, everything went as well as one could hope. Upon finishing the cave, Octo was just 9 seconds off of the best Mole Cave he had ever achieved. This is significant, as the swings in RNG will have usually kicked in by now, making it more likely that runners will end up behind the pace they're hoping for. Let's move forward to the department store that I was talking about earlier. This is where runners stock up on explosives that'll carry them through the next hour and some change, allowing them to deal massive amounts of damage to bosses. After this is done, when you try to leave the department store, the lights go out and Paula is kidnapped by the department store spook, leaving you with only 2 party members. In order to escape, you have to reach the top floor and fight the boss in the manager's office. This is easier said than done, as on the way up, there's a ton of enemy spawns which will likely end a run if they're encountered. To make this worse, you have to travel up these escalators, which move the player automatically. This means there's no way to despawn the enemies, and because they can move even while you're on the escalator, there's almost nothing that can be done to avoid an encounter. These enemies are hard hitting, and if you get a bad encounter formation, it's almost always fatal. The mystical wrecker can charge forward, one-shotting any character they hit, and they'll use life up to heal off any damage. If there's a Musica enemy, outside of normal attacks, they can use a double lightning attack and even put players to sleep. Department store is where runs go to die, mainly because most of what happens here is outside of your control. The only thing runners can do in response to this is make a safety save on the bottom floor and resume quickly if they take a death. However, like most top runners, Octo doesn't do the safety save and goes straight for the top room in the department store. When reaching the top floor, a ton of enemies are waiting for him, resulting in an encounter with 2 records and a Musica. Octo manages to get a super bomb out before Jeff dies to the Musica's lightning attack, and Ness is able to survive against the last record. This leaves Octo with only 1 character alive for the spook fight that's coming up. This boss has a range of offensive PSI abilities with a bit of healing, which isn't a problem normally, but with Jeff dead it becomes a little more complicated. The spook has 610 HP, and the super bombs only deal a range of 135 to 405 damage. Ness has 3 super bombs left, and 1 needs to be used for later. Now Octo could use PSI abilities to try to bring down the spook, but with PSI Rockin's potential to miss, this needs to be used as a last resort. So without Jeff being alive to use a BBR, the 2-turn win is unlikely, and the fight becomes much more dangerous. Thankfully, Octo rolls a 342 and a 288. Not just that, but the spook doesn't even use any healing abilities, so he clutches out a 2-turn battle. Now this isn't optimal, but considering how this could have gone much worse, saving 22 seconds is massive here. Just a few minutes ahead in the backwards world of Moonside, more RNG can rear its ugly head when it comes to a boss called the Manny Manny statue. Manny Manny comes in at 860 hit points, which isn't too much, but it could give him a couple of turns to devastate the party. Manny Manny can use Paralysis Alpha, which is devastating if it hits Jeff. Then it can flash a Glorious Light, which is the equivalent of PSI Flash Omega. Flash in general can inflict status effects, but the one I want to focus on for Flash Omega is the chance to instantly kill party members at a whopping 40% rate. This is avoided on Ness thanks to an item called the Night Pendant that was picked up earlier, which negates the effects of Flash abilities. However, Jeff is still vulnerable to this Flash, so runners just hope that Manny Manny doesn't use the ability. Manny Manny is definitely more of a silent killer compared to its department store counterpart, but Octo gets extremely lucky on turn 1. Manny Manny uses PSI Magnet Alpha, which is harmless in this situation. Octo then manages to get through with an extremely high BBR damage roll and a decent Rockin' Beta damage roll, taking down the boss in just 1 turn. Usually this fight takes 2 turns or more, so Octo made out like a bandit with this one, losing only 6.5 seconds due to enemy spawns in the area. Things wind down for the next 20 minutes, with Octo gaining about 20 seconds in the upcoming Monkey Cave and Monotoli Tower splits. There's only a minor amount of RNG in these sections, mainly focusing on runner reactions and menuing. Back in Winners is the 3rd Sanctuary and its guardian, Shroom. Shroom doesn't do much in the way of damage, but he will rotate through healing and inflicting status effects. Ness and Jeff get hit with the status effect in Octo's run, but thankfully no characters turn on the party, letting him clear the fight in 4 turns by using PSI abilities and BBRs. This is about average, letting Octo maintain his 2 minute and 40 second lead going past the halfway mark at the game. Getting back to the action, we're going to move past Summers and getting the 4th party member, Pooh. Octo needs to sail across the ocean to Scaraba, but encounters a boss along the way called the Kraken. Kraken has several devastating attacks. Breathing fire and creating a tornado will do massive damage to the whole party. Then there's Flash Beta, which can inflict a range of status effects on the party or even kill individual party members, kinda like what I mentioned earlier. Kraken's weaker actions like the crashing boom bang attack and emitting a pale green light are what runners want to see during the fight, but like most boss fights, it's up in the air as to what could happen. However, Kraken only has 1097 HP, and with the player getting 4 chances to deal damage in a turn, it's possible to beat this boss in just 1 or 2 turns. Octo takes the crashing boom bang attack from Kraken on turn 1, a great start. He then uses super bombs and a BBR to take down Kraken right after, grabbing a 17-second time save and increasing his lead to over 3 minutes ahead. Next is Pyramid, and this is arguably one of the most technical parts of the Glitchless run. The goal is to get to the bottom of the dungeon, activate a switch for the secret passage at the top, then escape to South Scaraba via that passage. The narrow walkways and stairs make their return, and most of these rooms have little room to maneuver. There are also scripted hieroglyph encounters riddled throughout the pyramid. These guys are just sitting on the wall, waiting for the player to run by them so they can ambush you. These enemies won't end a run or anything like that, but they sure will waste your time. The way to get around this? There was a shop back in Summers which sold the deluxe version of skip sandwiches, giving players faster movement speed for 20 seconds. This can be used to bypass a lot of the enemies, since they can't start an encounter when the lead party member transitions to a set of stairs. Even with this strategy, it's likely that runners need to despawn at least a few enemies or force a green swirl to make it all work. Octo only needed to despawn enemies twice in the pyramid, an absurdly low amount. Every random encounter he got into was a green swirl, ensuring first try runaways, and he even got through the last hall before the pyramid's exit with 0 encounters. Octo clears Pyramid in just over 4 minutes after first entering the area, and his reward is 1 minute and 14 seconds of time save, putting him 4 minutes and 18 seconds ahead of his personal best. Up next is Dungeon Man, where players have to go through the area once, come back out and talk to the native at the bottom of the desert, revealing to the player that they need a submarine to reach the next area. This causes players to have to go back inside Dungeon Man and get the yellow submarine to reach Deep Darkness. This dungeon has a range of enemies to deal with, some of them being the mystical records from earlier, and others being UFOs which are difficult to run away from, resist elemental PSI, and can throw up PSI shields to cancel out those abilities entirely. Lesser mooks also start to show here, with similar movesets to the department store Spook. This enemy can also diamondize characters, which renders them useless until they are healed through various means. The movement in the overworld for these enemies are erratic and can quickly catch the player if they're not careful. A lot of time can be lost here, and that's exactly what doesn't happen with Octo's run. Octo clears Dungeon Man with 0 encounters, increasing his lead to nearly 5 minutes ahead. Considering that at least 3 or more encounters are common in this area, it's an amazing feat to say the least. Getting through Deep Darkness, Ness and the gang find out that many of their companions have been kidnapped by the Starmen and taken to the Starman base in Winters. Completing this dungeon gets Dr. Andonuts to begin work on the Phase Distorter, eventually letting players reach the final dungeon. Starman Base is brutal. High-level enemies start appearing in droves, and with PSI abilities being the main source of damage in random encounters, the enemies having various resistances keeps players humble. Running away is a multi-turn endeavor, so taking damage and status effects are almost guaranteed. The main way to get through this is to either despawn enemies, or hit the Starman sprites for the green swirls, as their movement makes it incredibly easy to take advantage of them. There's also the use of skip sandwiches to rush through the winding rooms, either to despawn them faster, or make use of the intangibility frames to bypass them entirely. I've personally seen runners lose out on several minutes when it comes to Starman Base, having to drop an attempt because it won't PB. As for Octo though, he absolutely crushes it. Most of the encounters Octo got himself into were green swirls, and everything else either had fast runaway times, or were just avoided entirely. Something else that I need to note, these bosses after Kraken are not really worth mentioning, as they pose a minor threat, and they're wiped out in just a couple turns max. This is thanks to the huge bundle of multi-bottle rockets that runners grab at the start of Deep Darkness. Remember, these rockets can hit up to 3000 damage each, so many bosses become minor speed bumps in the run. Starman Deluxe is one of these bosses, being defeated in one turn most of the time. However, even if the boss itself is an open and shut fight, the moment that comes after is extremely important to Octo.
デラックススターマンを倒した時に自己ベストになると思いました。ストーンヘンジは難しい区間の一つなので。
Coming out of one of the most difficult parts of the game, still nearly 5 minutes ahead of his PB is unreal. For reference, outside of getting a game over, Octo could go the rest of the game bleeding time away, and it would still be possible for him to get a new PB at this point. Now we enter the cleanup of the remaining sanctuaries. Lumine Hall is always first, granting access to the Lost Underworld, but then the remaining sanctuaries can be completed in any order. In Octo's run, he takes on Fire Spring right after Lumine Hall, then Magnet Hill, Pink Cloud, Lilliput Steps, and finally ending on Milky Well. Lumine Hall is a short dungeon with only 3 rooms runners need to go through to reach the boss, Electrospectre. These areas are filled to the brim with fobbies, which end up being walls in these narrow corridors, and fast-moving enemies who can easily catch players off guard. It's possible to lose a ton of time here, especially in the bottom floor's Horseshoe. This area in the beginning of the second room is the source of much pain for many runners. Both open sides of the Horseshoe are in range of having enemies show, and it's difficult to despawn anything on the left-hand side. Some runners need to move towards the right at a certain point to clear the path on the far left. From there, the despawning on the floor goes back to what you'd expect, and with a little bit of skip sandwich use, things can go pretty quick. The last room has a problem with the enemies spawning on top of the player, so going up and down the ladder here is the best way to do that. Combine this with more skip sandwich use, green swirls and encounter skips become possible here. Octo gets above average luck in his Lumine Hall. Several despawns and a couple of encounters in the last area set him back, but he does escape from everything first try. Before the boss, Octo grabs the most important equipment in the run called the Rabbit's Foot. This grants the user an additional 40 speed, greatly boosting the chances to run from an encounter, and giving Jeff the ability to hit more consistent damage with his MBRs. After letting a few MBRs fly at Electrospectre, Octo finishes the dungeon and it lands him 7 seconds. Pretty good since Lumine Hall is known to give runners a hard time. Next up is Lost Underworld and the Fire Spring. The first area is easy enough to get through. Runners just use Teleport Alpha and bump into the walls to both move quickly and dodge enemies. It's also important to note that before reaching Fire Spring, there's another important equip item called the Sea Pendant. This gives an immunity to flash and reduces fire and ice PSI damage. This equipment is essential to survive the rest of the run, and along with the Rabbit's Foot, it gets moved around to whatever character who needs it at the time. Going into Fire Spring, things can get pretty weird. All of the enemies in this area have some way of causing a ton of pain. The evil elementals can deal big damage in possessed characters. The psychic psychos come with various forms of fire and paralysis attacks, and the soul-consuming flames will also deal massive AoE fire damage. Not getting away from any of these enemies on turn 1 can result in major time loss, and honestly if something here can go wrong, it probably will go wrong. Again, the way to mitigate this is to force green swirls wherever possible, and make use of skip sandwiches and iframes. Then hope all the characters stay alive when rushing the Diamond Dog. The Diamond Dog fight will last at least 3 turns. 1 turn in the Carbon Dog phase, and the rest in the Diamond Dog phase. There's not much to say about Carbon Dog, but Diamond Dog comes out swinging with the physical reflect shield, bouncing back any physical damage. This is dangerous for Jeff as he doesn't have enough HP to survive the entire battle without healing. Ness can cover this, but Diamond Dog can do a few other things. First, the boss can bite down hard, diamondizing a character. He can also emit a glorious light, which as a reminder has a 40% chance to instantly kill any character. This can be mitigated by a Night Pendant and Sea Pendant, but Jeff isn't wearing this, so it's possible he'll die during those last 2 turns if Diamond Dog decides to be rude. Yeah, there's a lot that can go wrong here, so it makes sense that Octo gets the best Fire Spring split he's ever achieved in this category. This is 100% the hardest section of the cleanup, as this sanctuary is normally intended to be completed last. The others come down to small time games and time loss, except for Milky Well. Over the course of 3 out of the 4 sanctuaries, Octo gains just over 30 seconds. As for Milky Well, there's another layer of randomness as to what could happen. Runners want to be as high level as possible coming into the dungeon, as it affects if enemies will run away from the player in the overworld. These formulas dictate the chances any given enemy will flee from the player, and unfortunately in Milky Well, this is a coin flip. For example, one of the enemies, a Ramboob, is level 24. The sum of party member levels in Octo's run at this point is 168, so this means that the sum of levels only meet the threshold for a 50% chance for enemies to flee. Now this wouldn't be much of a problem, but running away from these fights first try isn't guaranteed, and failing could put players at a risk of getting hit with sleep and mastermind status effects. Thankfully, Octo was able to get through everything with a single encounter before the Sanctuary boss, letting him clear the area with a 6 minute and 15 second lead. Octo is going into the sequence to begin Magicant in 3 hours and 19 minutes, which is the fastest pace anyone has ever been on at this point in the category. As a comparison, the 2nd and 3rd place runs defeated Trillionist Sprout at 326.21 and 325.32 respectively. In order to awaken Ness's true powers before fighting Gaius, Ness needs to defeat the evil inside him blocking his power. This is much easier said than done, because Ness is going this section alone. Magicant works a lot like any other dungeon, with narrow walkways and spawns which block progress. The enemies here are fast and can deal a good chunk of damage in a short time. The Electro Swoosh and the Kiss of Death are not too big of a deal, but enemies like the Carefree Bomb can quickly deal damage via super bombs to Ness, and the Loaded Dice can call for help, making those battles more annoying as time goes on. To deal with this, runners bring a ton of items on Ness. The Rabbit's Foot and Sea Pendant are moved to Ness's inventory before entering Magicant, ensuring he can escape from battles more easily and gives protection during the Ness's Nightmare fight. Skip Sandwiches are also used to quickly despawn and juke enemies while approaching the next area, the Sea of Eden. And things here get a little bit dicey. The Sea of Eden is a swamp-like area, so no skip sandwiches can be used to benefit the player. Plus, there are 3 Krakens roaming at different points in the area. They move at least twice as fast as the player, and the encounters count as boss fights, meaning they can't be ran away from. Handling this area requires despawning and respawning of these enemies, and quick thinking to get them stuck on the walls while they're chasing the player. After dodging 3 Krakens, runners can reach Ness's Nightmare, and this fight is nerve-wracking to anyone who is on a PB pace. Nightmare can use one of several moves: Shield Beta, the physical damage reflect shield, flashing a glorious light, and finally Rockin' Alpha and Rockin' Omega. This is where things get silly. Once Nightmare uses Rockin' Alpha, he has a 50% chance to do any of the previously mentioned moves, or he will go into a scripted sequence of Life Up Beta, then Rockin' Omega on the turn after that. This fight cuts it pretty close, so here's how runners take on this boss. Over the course of the entire run, runners have grabbed bags of Dragonite from different areas of the game. The first in Monkey Cave, right after Moonside, the second from the Village Elder in Tenda Village, right before Lumine Hall, and the last one at the beginning of Magicant. Now these bags of Dragonite are very strong, single-use consumables. Unfortunately, they deal fire damage, and Ness's Nightmare is 75% resistant to fire. So runners need to hope that they get rolls which total to at least 1,654 HP in damage. Damage from the bags of Dragonite average out to around 500 for each used, so to supplement this shortcoming, a couple of super bombs are brought to ensure the win. However, this all assumes that Ness's Nightmare won't use Life Up Beta. So depending on how the fight goes, runners can easily get walled by this boss. Runners can grab a Magicant bat from the area before Sea of Eden as well, which not only is a backup for Ness's Nightmare, but it's also useful in case an encounter happens with a Kraken. Octo handles this segment pretty well, only taking a couple of encounters with each having a first try escape. He did take the Magicant bat in case of a Kraken encounter, but Octo managed to make it to the boss while juking each enemy. His Ness's Nightmare fight was scary at first. The boss took lead with the shield beta, reflecting all the Dragonite damage that Octo was dishing out. Ness's Nightmare also used Rockin' Alpha on turn 2, but thankfully the third turn was another Rockin' Alpha. Combining this with good damage from the Dragonite, Octo gets a 3-turn win in a very uncertain fight. His lead is immense now, closing in at almost 7 minutes ahead after Magicant. I asked Octopuscal about his thoughts on the entire segment, as this was one of the highest stress moments in the entire run, and here's what he had to say about it.
マジカントは敵にあまり遭遇しなくて安心しました。エデンの海ではネスの悪魔とのバトルで今思えば良くない選択をしました。ライフアップ使わなかったので負けていたかもしれません。
There are just 2 areas left now. Darkonet to get the meteorite for the phase distorter, and the Cave of the Past, the last dungeon before fighting Gygas. Darkonet doesn't have much to it. However, the enemies here are extremely dangerous. Status effects, star storms, and other debilitating actions await anyone careless enough to fight one of these encounters. Octo even gets surprised early on while walking behind a tree to optimize movement. He gets away from this encounter first try, but these escapes are far from guaranteed. Octo was thrown into a panic at first, but once he escaped, he regained his focus quickly and finished the split, losing only a second. After fixing the phase distorter and sending the party to the past, it's time to enter the Cave of the Past. The encounters here are just above the level of what was in Darkonet, and the runaway rates are just as up in the air. Similar to other areas, it's very unlikely that there will be a whole party wipe, but time loss could happen nonetheless. Octo has a rough start, getting back attacked by a wild and woolly Shambler and an Octobot. One of his characters ended up getting paralyzed and it took a few turns to get away, but other than that, he nails a bunch of green swirls and first turn runaways which carry him to the final room of the game. He's over 7 minutes ahead now, and all that's left is the final boss. The fight is split into 3 phases. Phase 1 with the Devil's Machine and Pokey, Phase 2 with Gygas only, then Phase 3 where it takes a set amount of turns to defeat Gygas. Phase 1 starts out with Pokey using an AoE offense reduction ability, but Gygas either uses Rockin' Alpha or Rockin' Beta. This turn shapes the outcome of Phase 1 and 2, as Rockin' Beta can one-shot both Paula and Jeff, as they both have lower HP than the ability's damage cap. It's possible to recover from this, but it's incredibly difficult. The goal is to keep all the characters alive, have Paula use PSI Shield Sigma to protect from any future PSI attacks, as Gygas will keep using Rockin' every turn. Pokey will rotate between lowering offense and charging forward to someone, so runners use Nest to try to paralyze Pokey, which makes Phase 1 completely safe. Phase 1 ends when Pokey is defeated, and while his pool of 2000 HP isn't huge, his speed creates a problem for Jeff and his MBRs. Pokey has a speed at 60, and even with the Rabbit's Foot, Jeff is likely going to have at least 2/3 of his hits from the MBR miss. This translates to around 1000 damage, give or take with each use of the MBR. This damage can be supplemented with super bombs left over on other characters, completing the phase in 2 turns if runners are lucky. Octo gets the Rockin' Alpha, securing his path to Phase 2 and ensuring a new record. Now, you might be thinking this is a bit premature for me to say, but let me explain. Before the fight started, Octo made sure that the Franklin badge and the Sea Pendant were both on Paula. In Phase 2 and 3, Gygas no longer has the Rockin' ability, and switches to another set of abilities that include Freeze Beta, Thunder Beta, and Flash Beta. Paula's items and equipment now protect her from Flash and Thunder completely. As for Freeze, she can still be solidified, but now she only takes about 10 damage at a time. Combine that with Gygas being nice and potentially skipping his turn, this gives runners a pass through the rest of the fight. Gygas has 2000 HP in Phase 2 and can now be damaged. MBRs will not work for damage here, however, as Gygas has 80 speed, stacking the MBR hit formula heavily against the player. This means that super bombs and PSI abilities are king here. with Pooh's Starstorm Omega taking the lead for damage. This ability can deal anywhere from 540 to 900 points of damage, and if runners are lucky, it will end Phase 2 in just 2 turns. Octo clears this in just 33 seconds, getting rolls of 849 and 798 on the Starstorm Omega, with the Freeze Gamma and Super Bombs cleaning up the rest. This was a perfect Phase 2, quickly pushing the fight into Phase 3. Phase 3 is simple as the damage inflicted is scripted. All runners need to do is to use Prey with Paula for 9 turns, and that's it. The speed of this phase though is effectively random. Runners will want everybody but Paula dead at this point, as less text is generated on AoE attacks, and less actions are needed to complete a turn. As for Gygus, runners want him to use anything but thunder attacks, as the animations are the slowest out of the bunch. Octo had a ton of lightning attacks thrown at him, which killed off the whole party except Paula. There were only a couple of turn skips total, so not much time was saved on that front. Octo even got solidified near the end, but as we already know, it didn't matter. As someone who is familiar with the game and has put thousands of hours into attempts, I can say with confidence that this run may stand for a very long time. Octopuscal has set the bar extremely high when it comes to being a top runner in EarthBound. He's already proven himself in so many categories already, but I think this is one of the greatest speedruns of EarthBound that he's ever performed. I talked a little bit more with Octo on his plans for EarthBound and the future of his speedrunning career. Here's what he had to say.
しばらくはアースバウンドの乱数調整なしのグリッチレスは走らないつもりです。マザー2の乱数調整なしのグリッチレスか、乱数調整ありでのグリッチレス。他にもアースバウンドやマザー2のフォトパーセント、あとはアースバウンドの RSO もやってみたいですね。いつかアースバウンドの新しいグリッチレスの乱数調整を作るかもしれません。とにかくやりたいことが尽きないんですよね。いつ私はこのゲームをやめられるんですかね。